Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor James Edwards. And today's discussion is based on his book titled The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition. I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below, and also in the pinned comment just below that. And with that being said, thank you for joining me once again, James Edwards.
Thanks. Nice to be back.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. So, as usual, when we talk about the Gospel of the Hebrews, James, I'd like you to do a brief recap on what is the Gospel of the Hebrews.
Great. Yeah, that's a good place to begin. The Gospel of the Hebrews, or the Hebrew Gospel, is a text that we know from a great number of sources in the first century, but it's a non-extant text. That is to say, there's a historical report of it, but we do not possess this document, as we do, say, the New Testament. It belongs to a whole family of documents like the Diatessaron that we know existed, but are no longer extant. There are more than 24, there are actually 26 separate references, texts that claim to quote from the Hebrew Gospel. They range from the end of the first century, would be reference in the Talmud, to the Mishnah, I should say, until the 10th century. So throughout the first millennium of the Christian faith, of Christian history, we have written attestation to the Hebrew Gospel. There are, among those 26 different references, one of which incidentally is an Islamic reference in the Hadith. There are some 75 different quotations from it, citations. The church father who quotes from it most frequently is Jerome. The text is most frequently referred to as the Hebrew Gospel according to Matthew. A dozen of the early witnesses attest its author as Matthew. This will not be the author of the Gospel of Matthew, but another Matthew. There are 4 different Matthews mentioned in the New Testament. Matthew was the second most common name among Jewish children, so it's not too surprising that there is more than one Matthew in the early church. Equally, there are 11 witnesses that say it was written in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, not in Syriac, but in Hebrew. And we should maybe say a word here at this point. There has been a document called the Toledoth Jesu. It's also attributed to a man by the name of Shem Tov in the Middle Ages. And a number of people have made the attempt to argue that this Toledoth Jesu is in fact the Hebrew Gospel. And I'd like to say that's just so unlikely that it's absolutely impossible. The Toledoth Jesu is a medieval document, wasn't known before about 1300, and it's a strong polemic against Christianity. In the Toledoth Jesu, Jesus is a magician. He's perhaps someone like the Magi who came to visit in Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 1. The quotes from the Jesus in the Toledoth Jesu, not a one of them synchronizes with any of the quotations in the Hebrew Gospel. The 5 disciples of Jesus in the Toledoth Jesu really are taken from the Talmud. And point by point, the Toledoth Jesu is simply not the gospel according to Matthew that we know in the Hebrew tradition. It's a polemic anti-Jewish text or anti-Christian text from a Jewish perspective in the Middle Ages. So I think it's important just to move that one off of the table and say there's no characteristic there. Can I go ahead and make one more point?
Sure.
A second important point in my book is the relationship of the Hebrew gospel to the so-called Q document. The Q document was really first hypothesized by Schleiermacher in the early 19th century. It's gone through, it's had a long life, but it really hasn't changed very much. It claims to be a source of Jesus's sayings. There are no miracles in it. There's no passion narrative. There's no birth narrative. It's a story of his teachings. It's a good Jesus that was very much groomed for the interests of the 19th century German liberals. Jesus as a teacher, but not as a miracle worker, not as a son of God. The Hebrew gospel doesn't have much to do with this kind of a Jesus. In the back of my book, I give a listing of the occurrences of Semitisms in the Gospel of Luke. And I've just been going through those, and I thought I might read that. In Luke chapters 1 and 2, those are the birth narratives, we see a very heavy predominance of Semitic sayings. Then, as soon as we get to chapter 3, through the mid part of chapter 4, the adherence to the Hebraisms are very light. In the middle of chapter 4 to the middle of chapter 5, they're moderate. From chapter 5 to chapter 9, they're once again light. When we get into the narrative of Jesus going to Jerusalem in Luke chapters 9:51 through the Passion in 21:8, we see a moderate. They're consistent all the way through this unique material in Luke. It has no parallel in either Matthew or Mark. When we get into the crucifixion narrative, the Passion narrative in Luke chapters 22 and 23, light use of the Hebrew gospel. And then when we come to the final chapter, 24, it's much like the birth narratives. It's really heavy. So what do we have here? We have heavy use at the beginning of Luke, and then infancy narrative, really heavy use in that final chapter of Jesus, especially on the walk to Emmaus. And then we have a moderate, consistent use at 2 or 3 points in the middle, especially this travel narrative from in Luke chapter 9 through chapter 21. Jesus travels to Jerusalem. But at other places, mid chapters 3 and 4, chapters 5 through 9, very light. And in these light places where Luke is making minimal use of the Hebrew gospel, we see that he's making a heavy use of the Gospel of Mark. So we see this kind of alternation here. When Luke is using the Hebrew gospel heavily, he is not using Mark. When he's using the Hebrew gospel lightly, then he is using maximal use of Mark. And in the moderate areas, it can be both. Although, just one qualifying note, since there's no passage in the travel narrative of Luke, that is to say, from the end of 9 through Jesus's arrival in Jerusalem, there's no passage in those in that travel narrative that corresponds with either Mark or Matthew. So Luke is on his own there, and he's making a consistent use in those long 9 chapters of the travel narrative, looks like, of the Hebrew gospel. So that's kind of how it works out in the body and in the arrangement of the Gospel of Luke.
What does the Hebrew gospel say about the beginning of Jesus's ministry? Do the church fathers attest to those details?
Yes, the first reference that we see in the church fathers comes from Epiphanius it gives us the introduction of Herod the Great, and that Jesus appears in that period. So when you take Luke chapter 1, verse 5, that's a verbatim with the way Epiphanius says that the Gospel of Luke begins, that the Hebrew Gospel begins. Yeah, we have in the first 4 verses of Luke the wonderful introduction. And then it says, in those days, Herod the Great, who was the king of Judah, a priest named Zechariah arrived. This is exactly the way, according to Epiphanius, his reference, that the Hebrew gospel begins. And incidentally, Matthew chapter 2 begins with a very similar view there. And we also, so far as we can tell, find that the diatessaron of Tatian began there. So it looks as though we have a fairly strong agreement in the early church that the inception of the gospel, or the story should commence, the necessary character with which the story should commence, is Herod the Great and Jesus's birth under his regnancy.
Does the Hebrew gospel contain the virgin birth of Jesus and all the other infancy narrative details that's in Luke, or does it lack that?
Yes, it does. Those first 2 chapters of Luke, of course, are filled full of the virgin birth stories of both Mary and Elizabeth, stories of Zechariah, and so yes, it does have the stories of the virgin birth.
Does it include the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist?
Indeed. Yep. A long baptismal narrative with some kind of strange additions to it. It's been dealt with a lot of scholars, but yes, it does.
How different is it? What do those embellishments do to it compared to what we see in the canonical Gospels?
I can snoop that out for you and read it if you're interested.
Sure.
The Hebrew Gospel portrays Jesus as let's see. Well, I'm not going to take time to look at it. It portrays the Holy Spirit in kind of a different light, and it's a little hard to know what to do with this. It's important to remember that the Hebrew Gospel is never accepted in the early church as a viable gospel to join the 4. In the 4th century, late 3rd century, early 4th century, when Eusebius is dealing with the question of the canon, he makes 3 categories of texts. One of them is texts that always have been considered canonical. There's never been any doubt about them. And he lists there Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Acts of the Apostles, most of the letters of Paul, 1st John. Hebrews is questioned, James is questioned, Revelation is questioned, Titus is questioned. There's about 4 or 5 books that are questioned. And then there are others that are also being considered. One of them is the Hebrew Gospel. The Goodacre was another one. The Epistle of Barnabas was another one. And of course, the Hebrew Gospel and this other group of disputed Gospels doesn't make it. one of the points that Eusebius does is to say that Eusebius has a great deal of respect for the Hebrew gospel. It is not accepted as canonical, but it is accepted as a trustworthy attestation to the life of Christ. And this is a judgment that he makes, that Eusebius makes of no other of the rejected texts. And so the Hebrew gospel, although it doesn't make the canonical cut, so to speak, it's not rejected or dismissed. It continues to live in the life of the early church. It's being quoted over the space of 1,000 years by 24 different church fathers is a good example of that. It lives on as a respected witness to the early church's testimony to Jesus Christ.
Does the Hebrew gospel include the Olivet discourse?
Yes, it does. And this is going to be in yes, it does, but this is not one of the places where Luke is relying heavily on it. He's working more with Mark on that question, but it does include it.
Is it do the church fathers specify based on what they say? Does it look like it's shorter in detail than what we see in Mark's Olivet discourse, or is it identical with Luke's version of the Olivet discourse?
I can't answer that because Luke, in chapters 22 and 23, he's making a fairly light use of it. It's there, but he's relying much more heavily on Mark. And so it'd be hard to say on the basis of that comparison to what extent Luke is using it, how heavily he is using it.
I'll rephrase the question. Is it clear at all what the differences are between the Hebrew Gospels version of the Olivet Discourse and Mark's? Is there like a noticeable change in the way each one looks at the destruction of the temple? Or is Mark more focused on the destruction of the temple than the Hebrew Gospel?
I'm not sure how to answer that, Jacob, other than say your question is clear. It's very specific. I'm just not sure that I can give as specific of a response to it. The Hebrew gospel has this discourse, but how much of Mark's discourse or Luke's discourse, I should say, is dependent upon Mark or on the Hebrew gospels is harder to say.
Does the Hebrew Gospel mention Barabbas?
It does. It does.
All right. And do we know what it says about the trial of Jesus? Is it very similar to what we see in Luke's, or is it drastically different?
No, it's not drastically different. Luke 21 through 23, this is the trial of Jesus. He's making light use of the Hebrew gospel there. He's following Mark closely. He does the same thing in the Passion narrative largely that he does with the early part of Jesus's ministry immediately following the baptism. He's following Mark very closely and pretty completely.
I'd like to go back to Barabbas for a moment. I believe it's Jerome that states that he says that when he encountered the Hebrew gospel, that he interpreted Barabbas in the text to mean something different than it did in the canonical text, son of the teacher. What do you make of that?
Well, Bar Abba, son of the father. It's a Semitism, Barabbas. Yeah, Jerome wants to say the son of the teacher. Um, Jerome knew Greek and he knew Hebrew very well, so it's worth taking it seriously. Seems as though Jerome is using the word Abba, which is father, more metaphorically there. Perhaps students did call their teachers Abba. Wouldn't be too surprising if they did. And that might be the grounds for Jerome's theory there. But Jerome is the only one that I know who makes that theory.
Does the Hebrew gospel include the Eucharist? And if so, what are the textual differences between it and the Eucharist within the canonical gospels?
Yeah, great question. It does. And it so happens that the Eucharistic text that appears is one of those places in the Passion narrative that otherwise Luke is relying heavily on Mark, that in fact he switches to a very, very Hebraic text. And remember in Luke, his Eucharist text has the two cups. It starts with a cup, then we have the meal, then we have a second cup. It's a longer series. And Luke begins his story of the Eucharistic text, in which he says he has an articular infinitive, truly desiring, I desire to share this Passover with you. Luke chapter 2, verse 14. The hour came. Jesus reclined with the disciples, and he said to them, Epithumia, epithumesa, desiring, I have desired to share this Passover with you. In my book, I make a strong case for the fact that whenever we have this infinitive absolute, we have proof of a Hebrew exemplar, that the Hebrew is being used here. The infinitive absolute was a way that the Hebrew language signified emphasis. It simply repeated the same word twice. Aramaic doesn't do that. Latin doesn't do that. Greek and Syriac don't do this. This is a unique characteristic of the Hebrew language. It's a very effective one that you see in the Old Testament. Anybody who's read Hebrew gets used to these. Well, when Luke is saying epithumia, epithumisa, desiring, I desired, that is a literal translation into Greek of a Hebrew, of the Hebrew emphatic form there. And that's an indication that Luke is following the words of Jesus that he has received, and then the double cup, which differs greatly from both Paul, Matthew, and Luke's rehearsal of the Eucharist, shows that he is utilizing a different exemplar, a different source, and it's a source with many Hebraisms in it. So yes, the Eucharist in the Gospel of Luke is strongly Hebraic.
Is the Eucharist as attested by the church fathers within the Hebrew gospel? Does it have Jesus saying the same kinds of things that Luke has Jesus saying? Is he telling them to drink, to eat his blood, and is it, sorry, to eat his flesh, it's meat, it's bread, and to drink his blood, it's wine? Or does it lack him saying exactly those kinds of things?
Well, I don't know that I can speak for all the church fathers. I'm sure that they deal with this. It's a very, very important passage in Christian faith and in the ceremony of worship, the Eucharist. So there probably were several different renditions of it, but it looks as though the account that we have in Mark and in Acts, which would be probably from Paul, that they predominate. And we can say that because the earliest record of the Eucharist outside of the New Testament is from the Goodacre, that probably should be dated around 90, perhaps 100, but it's within the first century. It has the Eucharistic words that are verbatim almost with both Mark and with the 11th chapter of Acts.
What does the Hebrew Gospel say about the resurrection of Jesus?
The 24th chapter of Luke, which is the resurrection chapter, is just filled full of Hebraisms. It, along with the infancy narratives in chapters 1 and 2, is the most heavily resourced with regard to the Hebrew gospel. And so we can conclude that the Hebrew gospel included the resurrection and included it as an emphatic conclusion to the story. Once again, it's an evidence of the fact that the Hebrew gospel has nothing to do with Q, because Q does not have a passion or resurrection account to it.
Does the Hebrew Gospel include a passion narrative that is overall similar to the passion narrative we get in the Synoptic Gospels?
It does, yeah. Yeah.
Is the Hebrew Gospel and the Ebionite Gospel described by Epiphanius the same text, or is it different?
Well, it's hard to know if it's the same text. Epiphanius refers to the Ebionite Gospel, also the Gospel of the Nazarenes. They may have been different versions of the same text. They certainly were the same theme. They were the same narrative. It's not like some of the other texts that we know in the early church that differ from we know, for example, the tradition of the apostle, the traditions of the Gospel of Matthias, the teachings of the apostles, the Toldoth Jesu. These also tell the story of the Passion of Christ, but the Ebionite Gospel does not agree with those, and so it looks like, as far as I can tell, that Epiphanius knows of this Hebrew Gospel either in several different versions, or it could be one version that's known by several names. It wouldn't be surprising if the gospel didn't have a title and it was entitled different things by its earliest witnesses, which would mean it's a single text. It's important to remember that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament have no titles either in their earliest texts. So we might expect that the Hebrew Gospel likewise was untitled, and the three different titles given by Epiphanius do not refer to three different documents, but simply different titles for the same document.
Does the Hebrew Gospel portray Jesus as abolishing sacrifices, but not that his death is a replacement for the sacrifices himself?
I'm not sure. I'm going to have to pass on that. It's a good question. My inclination, Jacob, is no. the Hebrew gospel seems to have the passages that are quoted from the Hebrew gospel in the fathers seem clearly to see a sacrificial death of Christ, or to have a sacrificial death of Christ in mind when they quote it.
So let's take a couple of super chat questions. Austin James, thank you for your super chat. He did not include his question in it, but it's right here, just below it. I will say this. For future super chatters, please try to include it in the super chat and not after that. Anyway, Austin asks, I wanted to ask if this was related to Papias.
I'm assuming that your question, sir, is the Hebrew gospel related to Papias?
Yeah, I think that's what his question was. I think it has to
Right.
do with Papias mentioning it.
Right. Yeah. Papias does mention this. He's a very important source of information. He's oftentimes dismissed, I think, unfairly. So I see his testimony to the early Gospels to be highly important. It's certainly the earliest, and he claims to have had personal relationships with the earliest apostles, or at least their followers. And he subscribes the earliest Gospel to Matthew, and he calls it a Hebrew text. And many scholars have tried to dismiss the veracity or the importance of that by criticizing Epiphanius or Papias for other views that he had. But on this particular point, it looks to me that, and in my book, I think that I have shown that Papias's testimony is not just worthy of hearing, but it's very insightful. It's important with regard to the Apostle Matthew probably being the author of the original Hebrew Gospel. This would not be the same author of the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament.
Fisher Type, thank you for your super chat. How does Hebrew Gospel and Shem Tov Matthew compare?
Right. Well, I talked about that earlier, and they don't. Shem Tov is an anti-Christian polemic, strongly anti-Christian polemic, in which the purpose is to show that the Jesus of the Gospels was a fraud. He's a magician. In Rabbinic Judaism, magicians were at the lowest possible rung of credibility. The quotations of the Shem Tov, the Toldoth Jesus, do not agree with any of those that we have from the church fathers. Jesus's 5 disciples are taken from the Talmud. They're not taken from the Hebrew gospel. So there's a kind of a point-by-point refutation that the Shem Tov, late medieval, anti-Christian polemic, hard hitting against Christians, trying to discredit Christianity. The Hebrew gospel, we don't have any quotations of it after the year about 950. Shem Tov is written perhaps 12 or 1300, comes from a different era, different perspective, and it's unrelated to the Hebrew gospel.
So one last question I'd like to ask before we close. So exactly how many church fathers talked about the Hebrew Gospel?
I think I count up 20, maybe 22. They range. The last one is Nicephorus, who's the early 9th century. It's just amazing that this tradition lasts so long, and yet it does.
I Fisher Ty, thank you for another super chat. Thoughts on Nehemiah Gordon's Hebrew Matthew?
I don't know that there is any difference between his Hebrew Matthew and the ones that I've just talked about in Shem Tov. If there is, please let me know.
Actually, I'll ask one more thing about Shem Tov before we close. I think when some in the audience are asking about Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, I don't think they're talking about the Toldif Yeshu. Isn't there another text associated with Shem Tov that looks a lot like our Gospel of Matthew with some slight differences? Because I think that's the one they're talking about. And he's claiming that he translated that from Hebrew or something like that.
Well, Jacob, let's save that for another conversation. It's a good question. And if people are asking that question, I want to be sure that I'm giving a careful answer to it, thoughtful answer, and I'm not able to do that right now.
All right. Let's look at a couple more super chats that just came in. Jason Stewart, thank you for your super chat. Any thoughts on the Ebionite gospel? I think we already talked about that, though.
Right. Well, just a word about the title. When Epiphanius refers to this, he doesn't call it the Ebionite gospel, even though that's what we think he called it. He calls it the gospel that was written or was in use among the Ebionites. Now, there's a slight difference there. They could have been using a gospel, let's just say the Gospel of Matthew, and it would be then associated with the Ebionites. So the Ebionite gospel is an over-translation. It assumes that this gospel goes by that name of the Ebionites. We don't know that it did. We know that it was a gospel written in Hebrew that was used by the Ebionites. And that gospel, in my judgment, is the Hebrew gospel that we've been talking about here today.
Vishnachai, thank you for your super chat. Evan Bohan, well, okay, without any additional context, I'm not sure how a response is to be formulated, but thank you. So just to remind everybody that the link to purchase James Edwards' book on the Hebrew Gospel is in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, James.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you to all of you who are listening and who asked questions, and for those of you who didn't. I look forward to talking to you further about this.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.